probably know if you've been reading our work that we would regard ourselves as already in stage 3, in as much as we help people go and study so they realise that we're not a civilised society. We don't turn up and listen and help. We turn up with our preoccupations of our specialist lens, our thresholds, our budgets. These provide an incapacity to listen. So we do a lot of administrative work and passing on. I mean, if we eventually provide a service, it's standardised because it's market tested and market driven. The standardised services don't meet the need, so people represent. So we've got all of that going on. It's just adding costs. So we get them to study all that, which is really easy to study, because all you've got to do is take cases and ask them sensible questions. And you can see when you take the cases that someone might have had 107 different transactions with 17 different bodies. Nobody really helped them. At no point in all of this did anybody understand what actually mattered to them. No one looked at the world from their point of view. You can see why because we didn't do that, you can see why the things that we provided didn't help them. You can see the cost of doing all this. So then we help them employ straightforward principles that when someone puts their hand up, you turn up, all of them, don't qualify in any way, you turn up, you establish what matters to them, you establish what's happened, you establish their context, you help them define what good looks like, and it might be a good life or it might be a good death, but you help them define what good looks like. You help them take responsibility to achieve that, and then you draw from the community or the voluntary sector or the state. There's only the services that are required to help them on the journey that they have defined. The consequence of that is that many lives are quickly back on the rails and the costs are trivial compared to the costs of not doing it. So easy to study, easy to design, and then you hit the big problem of actually what you've got to do is redesign the way we provide services through 17 different organisations. We don't need 17. And that's where you hit the wall, because you've got all of these people with vested interests and agendas and politics and shit.
Yeah.
But that's the space we're currently in, that we can do the study, we can do the redesign, and then we're doing this in Manchester, for example. We're rather hoping that when they appoint the mayor, that this becomes the mayor's baby, because you need someone with the political clout to say, we're having one organisation called an organisation designed to help people whose lives have fallen off the rails. We're not going to have 17 of them doing their own specialist things. These specialisms are important, but they've got to be located on what we call a pull basis. So if specialism number 7 is relevant only to this demand and that demand, but it's the person who's interfacing with the demand who provides continuity in the relationship and pulls number 7 if 7's required, as opposed to all of 17 looking at you. Does that make sense?
Yes.
It's very simple, isn't it?
Rather than me introduce anecdotes, I think I'll let you speak. So could you talk a little bit about the structures you work in and under?
Meaning,
so you're obviously working for clients and or which are organisations,
yeah,
and within regulatory frameworks.
Yeah.
So maybe local councils. I'm interested to know about your an account of what that's like, because I'm not very aware of some of the places you're working with, or the means in which you're meant to communicate and coordinate with other people in approaching collective problems.
not sure this answers your question, but the regulatory frameworks are a problem because the thing I talked about earlier, that regulation works on the basis of specification and inspection, and so we have regulators who want to see all of the things that are dysfunctional in the current design. That whether you've done your assessments in certain times, or pass people on. So you can look good in a regulatory framework, but be doing nothing of value. The health service is the worst of them. The people who now manage the health service are the ones who are left. The good people went, and the ones who are left have been conditioned by 15 years of managerialism, and are really like puppets of the centre. Even when you take them through the study phase and they see what they're doing is actually dysfunctional for people, they kind of don't want to know, because to know would threaten their very existence in a regime that judges them on different parameters from above. Having said that, the way we intervene is the issues with regulation, audit, and any other control functions are the responsibilities of leaders, not us. We're not there to intervene on those matters. We're there to help the leaders create a dialogue with the regulators. We've done that in a series of occasions where, and this is quite extraordinary, where the leaders have taken the results of the study phase to a regulator, or involved the regulator or local auditor in the study phase. But where they've had to take them to a government regulator, which is by law, the regulations are enshrined in law, what we find is that the regulator will give them dispensation to move to a redesign, which I find an absurd idea, because effectively what you're showing the regulator is that your study phase has taught you that adherence to the regulations is not having a positive impact on the service, that it's dysfunctional in terms of service. So you'd kind of think the regulator would go, oh my God, if this is true for you, it's true for the whole of what we're doing in England or Scotland. Therefore, we've got to rethink regulation. No, they don't think that. They think, well, we'll let you go ahead with your redesign, but we're going to make you responsible. So you have to sign a series of documents that allow you to operate outside of the law. Improvement is banned by law. Do you understand? It's fucking bonkers. That's why I write about regulation in the Whitehall Effect and in other places.
Can you talk about some successes that you've had?
Yeah, many. Have you read our last periodical on people-centred services?
I don't believe so.
Emma will give you a copy to read on the train.
Thank you.
So there's a lot of stuff in there. There's a lot of stuff on the website where we publish results and successes. That we've got quite a lot of evidence, and if you want more than we've got there in the periodical and on the website, I can supply you with more evidence. But it goes back to the thing I was talking about earlier, that Whitehall doesn't do evidence. Also, I don't want Whitehall to do evidence. You see, if Whitehall understood the evidence and understood therefore that what's required is a different design, then Whitehall would promulgate that as an answer, whereas it's the route that teaches you how to think. So, if we just promulgated it as an answer, people wouldn't get the thinking, and so it wouldn't be successful. You've got to, it's through the study phase that you unlearn management. Because if you're a manager in a care service, you're preoccupied with caseloads and assessment targets and all the legal protections that you've got to cover yourself with, and that's what your life is. And if someone comes along and says, "Well, look, this is just it doesn't work. Do this instead." Well, you'd look at the "do this instead" and go, "No, that wouldn't work. That would offend all the things I'm taught as good management." So you have to take them through the study phase for them to see that all the things that they actually think of as good management are not good management. So it's normative learning.
So your successes, am I right in hearing, are to do with getting people to unlearn
Correct.
what they have been operationalizing?
Correct. So for another example is if you stand in a room and tell managers that targets make performance worse, some will think you're nuts. Some will think, it's okay if you set the right target or have the right people set the target. You see, you're telling them something that offends their worldview. So if they create dissonance, so they can only accommodate this dissonance by rationalising it into their worldview. That's human. If you take them out to study their organisation, and we know what to get them to do, they'll come back and say to you, targets are making performance worse. Correct. Now you've opened their mind to the general idea that arbitrary measures distort a system. So now you're in a place where you can start teaching them that if you use measures that aren't arbitrary, that are actual, and they're derived from the purpose of this service from a customer's point of view, and you improve on those things, then not only will the service improve, but the costs will fall. Now you see, they'd find that counterintuitive. If you started with a proposition, you stand in a room and you say to them, if you provide a better service, your costs will be lower. They go, no, because their heads are conditioned by the idea that better service is always more expensive, because it's about more resource or doing more for people. They can't understand that their current focus on efficiency damages effectiveness. And if you make a service effective, the costs fall out of it. So, in a typical, go back to care services, in a typical situation, so you can see from the mapping that someone's life fell off the rails, and you can see from the mapping they've had 117 interactions, and we've done this, this, and this, and this, and they're no better. In fact, they're usually worse. And so you can cost that up. Well, we currently spent £400,000 on this person, and they're no better off, or they're worse. Well, just conceptualise this in the redesign phase for the moment. Suppose we actually found out what really mattered to them, and then we have to go and do that, and we find out that if we understood what mattered to them, what they wanted to try to achieve, and we'd actually just help them do that, would it have cost £400,000? And the answer is no.
Do the current systems of administration help you achieve these successes?
No.
Very clear from your work. Can you talk about the difficulties of measuring outcomes?
Well, outcome measures are a tricky area, because very often when Whitehall people talk about outcome measures, they actually mean activity measures. So the number of people on parenting courses or the number of drug rehabilitation programs. These are not outcomes. The outcomes that you need to understand and measure are those that the individual sets for themselves in terms of a good life or a good death. That's what the statement of purpose is for that person, from which the measures need to be derived for that person, to which then the methods are employed, only that's required to achieve the purpose. And so you say you have this simple relationship between the purpose and the measures and the method. So outcome measures framed that way are idiosyncratic.
I cannot readily be standardised.
No,
Right.
never standardise. Because if you standardise, then you've just ignored variety. You know, of the 16 people whose lives have fallen off the rails in Buckingham today, there'll be 16 different contexts, needs, people, desires, statements of purpose. So, what's the word? Well, it'd be individualised measures.
Can you think of helpful and unhelpful examples of bureaucracies in relation to your work?
Well, a legion of unhelpful bureaucracies built around the idea of cost, efficiency, scale, so the whole of the DWP, HMRC, the regulatory frameworks, these are all built around the same basic ideas about industrialising services, going after cheaper services, but they actually drive the costs up. I mean, bureaucracies don't have to be like that. You can conceptualise. I don't think bureaucracy is necessarily a bad word. But if you think about Max Weber's idea that the important thing about a bureaucracy is that it's the same for all citizens, and your position in the hierarchy dictates what you're allowed to do and not do. And I think that was okay in a world where he was developing that, particularly in his culture, Germanic culture, where services to the populace were relatively limited. Today, we live in quite a different world, and standardisation in the Max Weber world had its virtue, but standardisation in today's world has no virtue at all. It drives costs up. But I do believe that you could build a bureaucracy or a management structure and a regulatory framework over better, effective designs. And I argue this in the Whitehall effect, that I say that if I use the purpose measures method framework, which is one of my frameworks, the fundamental error in regulation is that ministers and regulators take a view on measures and methods. I think their view should be limited to purpose. So if you take a view on measures and method, then you create a specification. And when you come and inspect for regulatory purposes, you're inspecting for adherence to your measures that you've imposed and your methods that you've imposed. So you create a compliance culture. I think that if you limit the regulator and politicians' involvement to purpose, then you make it a responsibility for the service provider to make their choices, not about purpose, but about measures and methods. And then when the inspector comes up as part of the regulatory process, the first question is, well, what measures and methods have you chosen in terms of achieving the purpose? And let's see how you're doing. So it would increase transparency. You see, in the current regime, you can be a bad bastard and get away with it. You can have a lousy service but get ticks from the regulator. In the environment I'm describing, it's very hard to get away with bad things because you've had to demonstrate the choices you've made, and then the inspector looks at what you're doing. So it increases transparency. But more importantly, it puts the locus of control in the right place because it will drive innovation.
How often do funding and administration systems change, and do they have continuity?
Yes, a lot and no. No, a lot and no, because these things, they're not based on any knowledge. So they're always sources of interference.
Right.
And they get people preoccupied with compliance.
So you have been looking at this for some time, right?
Yeah.
And that's over. So over 30 years, 40?
In the public sector, probably 17 years, probably around that sort of time.
So do the funding and administration structures allow long-term planning?
No.
Do they allow the latitude to implement policies and actions which are relevant and important?
Well, the Whitehall would say yes, and I would say no. Well, because Whitehall tends to determine importance. So, for example, they would tell the police to go after certain types of crime.
Yep.
So, funnily enough, police find them. So if they're going after violent crime, they'll criminalise our children for having a fight in a playground, or they'll count a domestic dispute as 2 assaults. It might not have been important to either criminalise the children or the husband and wife, but it makes your numbers. You could turn shoplifting into theft, and so on. People use their ingenuity to feed what's required in the hierarchy. I'd prefer them to use their ingenuity to understand and improve what they're doing. So it's very important, if you stay with policing for a moment, or the health system, or many of these systems, what's really the first and most important thing to understand if you're going to design an effective service is the nature of demand. And demand is different in Bournemouth from Edinburgh and Fife and wherever, it's different. So the design should be different. It should accommodate what demand is in public services.
Do you think there's the ability through existing structures to forge connections with outside organisations? So intersector working,
Do you mean
multi-agency working?
public and private, or public and voluntary, or both?
Both, I suppose. When people and organisations identify a need or expertise from whether it's community, private or public, that they've got the. Do you think people have the agency to have those conversations and strike up functional relationships?
Well, if you're asking that question, as it were, from the citizen's point of view into those agencies, I can't answer that because that's not my domain. But I can talk about the relationship between the public sector and the voluntary sector, and the public sector and the private sector. So if we take the public sector and the voluntary sector, that's been made hugely more difficult by the advent of commissioning. Because effectively what that does is it puts enormous bureaucratic structures, specification and inspection structures, over the voluntary sector in order to win contracts. So there's an onerous amount of work to do in winning contracts, and then you've got to subscribe to all of those things that they've specified in the delivery of the contracts, regardless of whether those things are important in terms of the service that you're delivering. They're thought to be important by the commissioner, but what you actually find is they're an encumbrance, and they're a distraction, and they're consuming resource, and they can often take the focus away from what's important in the delivery of that service. And I'm not the only person to observe this. If you look at the work of the locality organisation, which is like a trade association for the voluntary sector, they're saying the same thing. If you look at the National Coalition for Independent Action, which is an organisation from within the voluntary sector. But they used to have a slogan which I really loved, which is we're not an arm of the state, we have our own arms. Okay, so they fought this phenomenon. When we look at the relationship between the public sector and the private sector, well, this has largely been driven by all governments since Thatcher on the basis that the public sector's better, isn't it? Sorry, the private sector's better, isn't it, at delivery? That's not true. Better is a matter of method. And I happen to take the view that if better is a matter of method, then if we can get the public sector to employ better methods, we'll have better services, lower costs and pay less tax. The way typically in which outsourced contracts are arranged between the public sector and the private sector advantages the private sector insofar as if the service is bad and demand rises, it costs more money, and we've seen this in so many contracts, equally, if you hear the kind of thing that Capita are doing, and there are many examples of this, the DWP programs that they've outsourced, on work capability, that kind of thing, they're driving targets to disadvantage people or punish really the people who are at the bottom end of life. I think that's all bad. I can't see any theoretical merit for the private sector being better. I can only see great examples of wasted money. It's public money.
So when you talk about commissioning, are you talking about what would be referred to as procurement?
Yeah. Well, in procurement's a wider issue, but commissioning is a new phenomenon. So it's recent, in the last 5 years. And it's the way in which public sector organisations like local authorities and the health service go and buy services from the public sector, from the private sector and from the voluntary agencies, based on no understanding of demand. It's really interesting, so if you're a commissioner and you want some drug treatment programs, the best they get at understanding demand is counting up the number of drug treatment programs they had in this geography last year. They never asked the question, how effective were these? And if they studied and they learned that these were largely ineffective, the first question they should be addressing is, well, how can we help these people with these drug problems in a manner that's effective? That's what we're looking for first. And so this goes back to, well, actually the best thing to do is to commission on the basis of attitude, not price, that what we want is a drug treatment partner who will not just deal with the drug problem, but will deal with the person, context, what matters, and do the thing I described earlier in terms of what a good service looks like. So together, between the commissioner and the provider, we can learn about what effectiveness means. Currently, all they're concerned about is buying someone who can do 400 programs next year, or whatever it is, and then paying them for it. And if they can buy that cheaper than somebody else, they think they've done God's work. It's not funny.
I'm laughing in the strictly Monty Python sense.
It's fucking absurd, isn't it?
It is absurd, and laughter is, an important medicine. Otherwise, my head would just explode.
Yeah, but I'll tell you what else. I've been talking to some of my people who work in this space, and we're seriously considering whether we should build a counselling support, because they see some terrible things and they witness the failure to help people who could be helped. It's hard to sleep at night when you know this.
There must be incredible emotional double binds at work and high stress. Can you talk about the language used in administration, outcomes and measurements, and whether this language is adequate to represent the realities?
Well, I mean, I suppose, I'm not sure this answers your question, but, what I've seen in the administration and measurement, the broad specifications world, is that it's based largely, regardless of which party you vote for, based largely on the ideas of economy of scale, industrialisation, cost focus, activity focus, arbitrary measures like targets and standards and service levels. And all of that is dysfunctional. It's man-made, we can change it, it's dysfunctional, but they're not aware of the dysfunction. And if you make them aware of the dysfunction, they tend not to like you very much.
Which is, an issue. Do you feel that the sectors or your work is adequately funded or resourced?
My work is adequately funded or resourced. The Vanguard's work.
Yes.
Or the service work.
I suppose both. I'm wondering how.
Well, ours is not an issue because we're
Perhaps it's there when you're ready.
in the scheme of things, we're a cash-rich company, so it's not an issue. We earn a lot of money in the private sector. We do things at cheaper rates in the public sector. We do a lot of pro bono work in the voluntary sector. So ours is not an issue. But if you ask the question about is the public sector adequately funded, I would argue that it would be, if we can design effective public services, current budgets could be slashed. We don't need all this money. We pay all this money for ineffective services. Whitehall will tell you that people are getting older and demand is rising. Only one of those statements is true. People are getting older. When you study demand, you find it's stable. What is rising is failure demand, because the services don't work. When you design a service that works, the failure demand disappears. Equally, and we didn't expect this, the original value demands also fall. Because better families, better communities, so things are getting better. From just the first step, in terms of going from an ineffective, cost-focused service design, industrial type, to going from that to an effective design, designing against demand, you see a dramatic fall in the costs as well as an improvement in the service. So just based on that jump, we could be running the public sector at much lower costs.
What role should broader society play in facilitating your work?
Very difficult question.
Okay.
It's a very difficult question, you see, because it'd be nice to be able to say, they should champion good things. The trouble is that broader society is educated by the media, and the media shares a narrative with the politicians. So broader society believes in a lot of things that are dysfunctional, like the private sector does it better, or we're paying too much money, or demand is rising, and the problem is bloody old people, which is actually not the problem. It's not the greatest consumer resource, actually. So there's kind of, I do my best to help by communicating the things that I know in the simplest language possible to make people curious. But I don't think we could ever expect society to argue the things that need to be argued. For me, it's the same. You hear Whitehall talk about co-production. And now I get that. If I'm a social worker working with a paraplegic, and I'm trying to work on, what do you want to get out of life? I get that co-production, get that level, but Whitehall generalises, I don't think the public would want to or could take a view on the design of the planning service, or the design of the bin service, or the design of the homelessness service, or how to design a fucking service. Why would they know? And so I think it's very dangerous. You know, I mean, I wrote the Whitehall Effect, hoping it would sell to, you know, the average intelligentsia, to get them angry about the amount of public money that's actually wasted. But unfortunately, you know, the book didn't sell, so the effect didn't come through. But I wrote the Whitehall Effect in short chapters to make it very simple, to get people angry about the things they should be angry about.
How might the clients or service users best support in delivering support then?
Well, I mean, the service user, in effective service design, if it's life has fallen off the rails type service, their definition of where they want to get to is integral to the design of the service, but not in the bins.
Yeah. And my final question would be, what questions do you think are important in working towards greater understandings?
Amongst whom?
Everybody who's interested in trying to work out what's going wrong.
Oh, well, those would be questions along.
And how to make things right, working. How do we make working services?
Well, those would be questions that drive you towards knowledge as opposed to opinion. So there'd be questions like, what do you know about current performance? And I mean know, as opposed to have a view about. Have you studied? So in Vanguard language, what do you actually know about demand? When I was on the radio with Peter Day, I said to him that managers of the public sector don't know anything about demand coming into their organisations. He couldn't believe that. How could you run a service organisation without understanding demand? Well, they do. They treat demand as volume. So if you just treat demand as volume and 80% of that demand is failure demand, you've missed a kind of big trick, haven't you? So you've got to understand what the original demands are, the value demands. And if you've understood that, a second thing you need knowledge about is how well the service responds in terms of what matters to the customer or the citizen. You've got to measure that. Then you get a shock, because that tells you something different to your reports on targets and activity, the things that you're used to as a manager. You've got to look, if you're looking at people's lives have fallen off the rails, you've got to look at the question I talked about earlier. Did at any point in time did we understand this person, their need and their context? And the answer is no, we didn't. So here, there's 3 bits of knowledge that ought to be prerequisites to doing anything about it. Because if you don't make those things prerequisites, you're not in a good place to start thinking about how to design a service that works.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure.
Very stimulating. And it's really, really valuable to be able to get